Before we begin with the next Caesar's battle against the Germans, don't forget to subscribe. Let us begin. The Meuse rises from the Vosges Mountains, which are in the territory of the Lingones, and after receiving a tributary from the Rhine called the Vacalus, forms the island of the Batavii and flows into the ocean, and enters the Rhine 80 miles from the sea. The Rhine rises in the territory of the Leponti, who inhabit the Alps, and flows swiftly for a long distance through the territories of the Nantuates, Helvetii, Sequani, Mediomatrici, Trebosi, and Treveri, and when it approaches the ocean, it splits into several branches, forming many large islands, most of which are inhabited by fierce and barbarous tribes, who are believed to live on fish and bird eggs. It empties into the ocean through several mouths. When Caesar was no more than 12 miles away from the enemy, as agreed, the envoys returned to him. On the way, they earnestly requested that he advance no further. When this was denied, they asked him to send ahead to the cavalry, who had advanced to prevent any engagement and to permit them to send envoys to the Ubi. If their leaders and senate gave them their word, they would accept Caesar's terms. They asked for 3 days to complete these arrangements. Caesar believed all this was meant to delay so their absent cavalry could return. Nonetheless, he said he would advance no more than 4 miles that day to get water. They should come to him the next day in as large numbers as possible to discuss their requests. Meanwhile, he sent messengers to the commanders who had gone ahead with the cavalry, instructing them not to engage the enemy, and if attacked, to hold their ground until he and the army had approached. But the enemy, as soon as they saw our cavalry, numbering 5,000, though they had no more than 800 cavalry themselves, as those who had gone across the Meuse to forage had not yet returned, quickly attacked our men, who were not expecting it since their envoys had just left Caesar, and that day had been requested by them for a truce. They suddenly attacked, throwing our men into confusion. Then, according to their custom, they leaped from their horses and attacked on foot, driving many of our horses out from under their riders, and putting the rest to flight so quickly that they did not stop until they came in sight of our main force. In this battle, 74 of our cavalrymen were killed, including the very brave Piso, an Aquitanian of the highest rank, whose grandfather had held the kingship in his state and been called a friend of our senate. He had gone to help his brother, who was cut off by the enemy, and saved him from danger, but was himself thrown from his horse, and, as long as he could, fought bravely on foot. When surrounded and struck by many wounds, he fell. His brother, who had by then left the fight, saw from a distance, spurred his horse to the enemy, and was also killed. After this battle, Caesar judged that he could no longer listen to their envoys or accept any terms from those who, after seeking peace through deceit and ambushes, had voluntarily waged war. Waiting for their forces to increase and for their cavalry to return was, he believed, the height of folly, and knowing the instability of the Gauls, he understood how much more authority the enemy had gained among them through this one battle. He decided no time should be given for further planning. With these decisions made and shared with his commanders and quaestor, he resolved not to miss any chance for battle. The very next morning, the Germans, under the same pretense and deception, came in large numbers with all their leaders and elders to his camp, allegedly to justify themselves and explain why they had fought the day before against their own request, and to see if they could obtain a truce through deceit. Caesar, glad they had come, ordered them to be detained and led out all his troops from the camp, instructing the cavalry to follow closely as he believed they were still shaken from the recent battle. With his army arranged in 3 lines and quickly covering an 8-mile distance, Caesar reached the enemy camp before the Germans could realize what was happening. Terrified by the sudden approach and the departure of their leaders, they were thrown into confusion and given no time to form a plan, decide whether to lead their troops against the enemy, defend the camp, or seek safety in flight. Their fear, indicated by noise and running about, spurred our soldiers, angered by the previous day's treachery, to storm the camp. Those who quickly managed to grab their weapons briefly resisted our forces, fighting among their wagons and baggage. But the rest, including women and children, since they had crossed the Rhine with all their possessions, began to flee in every direction. Caesar sent the cavalry to chase them down. When the Germans heard the shouting behind them and saw their comrades being killed, they threw away their weapons, abandoned their military standards and fled from the camp. When they reached the confluence of the Meuse and Rhine, and all hope of escaping by flight was lost, a large number were killed, and the rest, driven by fear, exhaustion, and the force of the river, drowned themselves in the river. All of our soldiers, with very few wounded, returned to the camp unharmed from this terrifying battle, despite facing an enemy force of 430,000 men. Caesar then gave permission for those he had detained in the camp to leave. They, fearing the tortures and punishments from the Gauls, whose lands they had ravaged, said they wished to stay with him. Caesar granted them freedom. After concluding the Germanic War, Caesar decided for several reasons that he must cross the Rhine. The most justifiable reason was to show the Germans, who he saw were easily persuaded to come into Gaul, that they should fear for their own safety when they realized the Roman army could and dared to cross the Rhine. Additionally, part of the Ustipates and Tencteri cavalry, which I mentioned earlier had crossed the Meuse for plundering and foraging and had not been in the battle, had fled across the Rhine to the Sugambri and joined them after the defeat of their comrades. When Caesar sent envoys to them, demanding they hand over those who had waged war on Gaul, they replied that the authority of the Roman people ended at the Rhine. If he thought it was unfair for the Germans to cross into Gaul without his consent, why should he demand any authority or power beyond the Rhine? However, the UB, the only tribe from beyond the Rhine to have sent envoys to Caesar, had formed an alliance, given hostages, and earnestly requested his help because they were severely oppressed by the Suebi. Or if he were too occupied with public affairs to provide assistance, they asked that he at least transport his army across the Rhine. This would be enough help and hope for the future. The name and reputation of his army, having defeated Ariovistus and won the recent battle, were so great that even the most distant Germanic tribes believed they could be safe through the goodwill and friendship of the Roman people. They promised a large number of ships for transporting the army. For these reasons, which I have mentioned, Caesar decided to cross the Rhine. However, he thought it neither safe nor worthy of his own or the Roman people's dignity to cross by ships. Although the task of building a bridge was presented with the utmost difficulty due to the width, swift current, and depth of the river, he believed he must attempt it or otherwise not lead his army across. He designed the bridge as follows. Pairs of 18-inch thick beams, pointed a little at the bottom and cut to the river's depth, were driven into the river using machines. They were placed 2 feet apart and connected by crossbeams fastened on top to form a framework. Another pair of beams, set at an angle against the current and 4 feet apart from the first pair, were similarly fixed. These pairs of beams were then connected by additional crossbeams at the top, secured by brackets. The entire structure was made stable by these connections, and the greater the force of the river, the more tightly the structure held together. Once the frame was set, it was covered with planks and wickerwork. Moreover, piles were driven diagonally downstream to absorb the river's force, and additional piles were placed upstream to prevent damage from logs or ships sent by the enemy to break the bridge. In 10 days, the construction material was brought together, and the entire bridge was completed. The army was then led across. Caesar left a strong guard on both sides of the bridge and marched into the territory of the Sugambri. Meanwhile, envoys from several tribes came to him seeking peace and friendship, and he replied generously and ordered them to bring hostages to him. However, the Sugambri, since the bridge began to be built, having prepared for flight and encouraged by those from the Tencteri and Ustipates among them, had left their territories, taken all their belongings, and hidden in remote forests. If you, like me, are looking forward to see what is going to happen next, don't forget to put a like and subscribe. See you in the next video.